Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this Authors in Conversation panel featuring the 2025 Minnesota Book Awards finalists in the biennial anthology category, sponsored by the Minnesota Humanities Center. I'm excited that the anthology category was reinstated this year after having been discontinued in 2006. The Minnesota Book Awards is a program of the Friends of the St. Paul Library in the organization's capacity as the Minnesota Center for the Book. And this year's book awards are sponsored by Education Minnesota. My name is Carolyn Holbrook. I am a writer, an educator, and an arts leader, and have been involved with the Minnesota Book Awards for many years. I'm founder and director of More Than a Single Story, a Twin Cities-based literary organization. I won the Kay Sexton Award in 2010. I also won the Minnesota Book Award in the Memoir and Creative Nonfiction category in 2021. And I am also the co-editor of an anthology, We Are Meant to Rise, Voices for Justice from Minneapolis to the World, which was published in 2021 with my co-editor, David Mira. And it was selected as one of the One Minnesota reads in fall 2022. So for this installment of the Minnesota Book Awards popular Meet the Finalists series, I'm pleased to be joined by Brenda Child and Howard Oransky, editors of Dreaming Our Future, Ojibwe and Očhéthi Šakówiņ artists and knowledge keepers, published by University of Minnesota Press. Margret Aldrich and Michelle Filkins, editors of Locker Room Talk, Women in Private Spaces, published by Spout Press. Jeff Schatz, editor of Raised by Wolves, 50 Poets on 50 Poems, published by Graywolf Press. And Shannon Gibney, a co-editor of When We Become Ours, a YA Adoptee anthology, published by HarperTeen, HarperCollins publishers. Congratulations to all of you for receiving the finalist nod. So in the interest of getting the most of our time together, I'm going to begin with a round robin question that I'd like for each of you to respond to in turn. And then I'll have questions specific for each of you and your wonderful finalist book. So for all of you, could you tell us about your anthology, about its focus, and how your specific collection came about? Also, I noticed that in each anthology, we celebrate the merger of established and emerging voices. So could you also speak to the importance of amplifying the voices you want to be heard in today's world, where there seems to be an increasing need for our voices to be heard?
Yeah, today's world, that's always this right now, that's a scary enterprise to delve into. But yeah, this book was the book that I wanted as a teen transracial adoptee. Adoption is not a experience that's widely understood in American culture. People think they know, of course, and they don't know. There's just like a lot of propaganda. And the literature on adoption has been dominated by adoptive parents, particularly white adoptive parents. And so it's really been in the past like 10 to 15 years that adoptees have kind of reached a critical mass enough to start telling our own stories on our own terms. And, have sort of, we're old enough now. I'm 50 this year, woohoo! That, we're sort of, we have the skill set and we're in sort of institutions that we can, we can get in positions of power and we can actually, sort of compete at the same level as other people. I mean, I say right now that I truly believe that adoptees are writing as well as anyone else at this point. Also, however, adoptee literature is mostly in the form of memoir, which is great. Memoir has so much to offer. I write memoir sometimes, but my co-editor, Nicole Chung, and I, who is a Korean American adoptee, we really felt strongly that we wanted to make this a fiction anthology, and that there were aspects of adoptee experience, adoptee identities that really need to be explored in this field, in this topography, if you will. And so we got amazing stories from established writers, as you say, Mark Oshiro. We have Mariama Lackington has the opening story, which is hilarious. We've got like new writers who this was their first publication. Stephanie Valentine has a wonderful story in the anthology. Kelly Baker, I believe this might be her first publication. And anthologies, this is why I think it's so noteworthy and important that the Minnesota Book Awards has now created this category. Because, and what's that?
They reestablished it.
Oh, yeah. They reestablished it. Oh, okay. When was it? I know we've had this conversation.
I think it was in 2006.
Okay. So, I mean,
it feels new.
It feels new, especially for me. But we know that writers from historically marginalized communities, anthologies are often their first publication. It's their first opportunity to really, show what they can do and to get their voices out there and hopefully heard. And so, we were just so thrilled with the quality of stories that we got, and in multiple genres, right? So there's straight literary fiction. We have Lisa Woolram-Sujblom, who's like an amazing graphic novelist. She's got a short graphic story in there. We've got a horror story. We've got fantasy from Meredith Ireland. We've got, again, sci-fi from Stephanie Valentine. I mean, it's really amazing. So yeah, I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, you did. Well, I'm going to call on you, Jeff, because I know you.
First of all, just such an honor to be here in this virtual space with all of you and with you, Carolyn. Great to see you and hear your voice. So this anthology titled Raised by Wolves, 50 Poets on 50 Poems, came out last year, and we wanted to do something as Graywolf Press was approaching its 50th anniversary year. And, we in the editorial department kind of, discussed what kind of book that we wanted to put out, some kind of anthology, some kind of celebration, some kind of way of nodding to 50 years of Graywolf Press, not a small amount of decades for a press our size and of our kind, especially as a small, independent and nonprofit press. But we also wanted to create an anthology that people actually wanted to read. We didn't want to publish a book that felt like a big, imposing, unwelcoming tome. The best of 50 years or, something like that. No offense to those anthologies and to those anthology editors. We didn't want to do a big Norton anthology kind of treatment, but instead, kind of as you're saying, Carolyn, in your question, amplifying our voices that we've supported over 50 years as a way of not looking back to 50 years, but looking forward to our time now and to the next 50 years. So as the editor tasked for this project, I wanted to get out of the way. I wanted to step out of my usual editorial and curatorial role and instead let our own poets be the editors of this anthology, be the curators of this anthology. So we reached out and invited 50 poets, each of them to select a poem that had been published across the 50 years of Graywolf Press and select that poem, which we would include in the anthology. And then that poet who selected it would write a brief one-page piece about it, because we also wanted it to have voices about what these poems do, how they move in the world, how established poets might talk about new and emerging writers, and writers really across languages. We publish a lot of work in translation. Poets from different countries, as well as many poets here in Minnesota. So what we wanted was something that the editors aren't just sort of imposing an editorial will, but that the voices of our own poets are instead kind of creating a chorus of conversation with each other. And that felt like the right idea and the right sort of welcoming spirit that we wanted to have for the anthology.
Yeah, I felt that when I read it as well. Thank you. So who'd like to speak next?
I was just going to say, Michelle, I'd love for you to kind of tell the origin story of Locker Room Talk.
Sure. First of all, thank you, Carolyn, and thanks to the Minnesota Book Awards and the Friends. And it's such an honor to be in this virtual room with all of you. I have so much respect for your work. So Locker Room Talk, you all probably remember comments that were made about locker room talk as a phrase that excused misogyny and some very poor behavior. That was something that I had been thinking about. But then I was in a locker room, an actual locker room at a YMCA in St. Paul. And I witnessed an incredible moment. There was a woman who was talking to another woman across the locker room. They were acquaintances, didn't know each other all that well. And their conversation started pretty casual. And then one of the women started revealing some really deep and painful situation that was happening in her private life. And the other woman wordlessly came over and gave her a hug. And the first woman was kind of tearing up and said, "Thank you for listening. I've never told anyone that story." And then they left. And I sat there and I just kept thinking, this is locker room talk. This is locker room talk, because it sort of gave me a way to put into motion something that I had been feeling for quite a while, which is that there was a narrative that was being created about women that excluded women. And I knew from my personal experience and from the experience of others that women-centered spaces are incredibly powerful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that locker room moment was a catalyst, because so often the moments that we think about are big moments. But those big moments, the Women's March that had 500,000 women, and sister marches that added another 3 to 5 million, those movements don't just happen. They start in locker rooms, in private conversations. They start in bathrooms where women are taking care of each other. And I mean, I don't think it's any coincidence or the cruelty of bathroom laws, because bathrooms are a space that are so important to women. And so I reached out to Margret and I said, hey, I have this idea. And we talked through it. And Carolyn, We Were Meant to Rise was definitely a book that we talked about as being a way that you can catalyze a lot of voices and bring forward something that's sort of in the air, but you're not quite sure how to capture it. We reached out to a few published writers that we knew well, and then we put a call out. And to get to the part of your question about the mixture of new voices and established voices,
Yeah.
It was amazing to us how many stories came through that were from people who wouldn't identify themselves first as writers, but they had a really compelling story to tell. And it was also interesting to see the commonalities in the stories. How many of the stories were somebody saying, I've never told anyone that? Or how many of the stories happened in a bathroom or at a kitchen table or in a space that you wouldn't necessarily think of? And then also pieces that talked about bigger movements. So I think that was a really important part of the book for us, to tell all of those stories and to let those voices come through, to sort of bring to the surface some of these things that are just part of women's lives, the way that we care for each other, but we don't necessarily acknowledge or celebrate those moments in the ways that we could or should. And so we really wanted this book to just sort of start a conversation in that direction and hopefully inspire people.
Yeah, you're making me think of the origins of More Than a Single Story. Once I decided to do it, I was in my daughter's beauty salon and we started talking about the stories that women have, that Black women have, and now More Than Single Story is going into its 10th year. So yeah, a lot of things happen in women's spaces that people don't realize. So I'm glad you did this book. Michelle, Margaret, did you want to add anything?
Well, Michelle did a great job. And that story of the actual locker room just really inspired me from the start, because we were all feeling angry at that time. It was during the pandemic. We were not, didn't have confidence in our leadership. And so to have a space to share women's stories and amplify their voices was so important.
So if Brenda and Howard would want to speak to the round robin question.
I'll jump in, Howard, since you're being silent, and talk a little bit about the origins of our book, Dreaming Our Futures, Ojibwe and Očhéthi Šakówiņ Artists and Knowledge Keepers. The book, I guess there isn't maybe a single origin point, but a few years ago, I'm a history professor at the University of Minnesota and also work in Indigenous studies more broadly. I wanted to establish a new research center at the university that recognized the contributions of George Morrison, who is who was actually our first professor of studio arts and American Indian studies in the early 1970s, which is a very interesting and exciting time, I think, in the Native community. Even though I was still, a kid when all those things were happening, I was certainly aware of all that. And so that happened. And then also my colleague Howard Oransky, who's the director of the Catherine Nash Gallery, had in mind that we should also have an exhibit that featured the work of American Indian painters. And I said, well, there's such richness in our region. Why don't we start with the people who are from this part of the country? And so that's why, so when we say Ojibwe, that means, it could mean the 200,000 Ojibwe people of the Great Lakes of the United States and Canada. And we wanted to be a little more inclusive and not just say Dakota people alone, but also to recognize the kind of vibrancy of the urban art scene in Minneapolis and of the community more broadly. So we wanted to be inclusive of people who are, closely related to Dakota people like the Lakota or the Nakota as well. And so that's the origin of the book. And just a little over a year ago, this exhibit opened at the University of Minnesota and the Nash Gallery. And it was fantastic. It was, we ended up featuring 29 painters from our region. And it was a very well-received exhibit by the community, the arts community, and also by our students at the University of Minnesota. One of the things I love to do is get my students talking and writing about art. And that's always a lot of fun. And they really embraced this exhibit. And then it went on to travel. It spent last spring and summer down in Rochester, which was great, giving us another kind of audience within Minnesota. And then for the fall semester, it was up at the University of Minnesota at Duluth. So if you look at Dreaming Our Futures, you'll see that there are 29 artists whose paintings were featured in this exhibit. We wanted to, and this was actually sort of Howard's idea, to make sure that we were acknowledging in the artist statement the indigenous languages of Minnesota. And so the artist statements are all translated into Ojibwe or into Dakota or Lakota. And that was something that we thought was especially important for a University of Minnesota exhibit, because we have Dakota and Ojibwe language programs both at the University of Minnesota. And we also wanted to, of course, acknowledge George Morrison. Some of you may know that the Metropolitan Museum of Art is right now organizing an exhibit of his work that will open next summer in New York, which is specifically about Morrison's New York period, when he was a very, right at the center of the abstract expressionist movement in New York at mid-century. So we kind of think of him as sort of a local guy who's done well, but he's more than just a local guy who's done well when you think of the 20th century history of American Indian and American art more broadly. So he, as well as Jim Denemy, our wonderful colleague who passed away a couple of years ago, as well as Andrea Carlson and Frances Yellow. We also invited a few of our colleagues to write essays for the book about some of the folks that are featured in the exhibit. So that's sort of where the book originated.
Thank you. And Howard, did you want to add anything?
Thank you. And thank you for including me in this award program. Here's a copy of our book.
Gorgeous book.
And I'll just mention a couple of things. One is that I became director of the Catherine E. Nash Gallery in 2011. And this exhibition of the American Indian painters is, I think, the third exhibition project that Brenda and I have worked together on. So it's part of a continuing collaboration of effort that we've been pursuing together, which has been really an enriching aspect of my time at the University of Minnesota. Going back to your earlier question, Carolyn, about the different voices, I would say from my perspective that the first voices in the book are the artworks themselves. So the artists who've made their, artists generally prefer to express themselves through their art rather than through language. Although of course there are plenty of exceptions to that generalization. So anyway, in my mind, the first voices we have are the artworks that were created by the artists, and then as Brenda mentioned, the next voices would be the voices, the written voices of the artists, and we do have their statements and their biographies that they furnished. And as Brenda said, we did translate their statements into Dakota and Ojibwe. Then there's the next, in my mind, the third voices, which are those essays, those 6 essays that you mentioned in the sheet that you sent to us. And Brenda invited these individuals to write for the book. I'll just give you my impression of these essays, how I experienced them as I was reading them. For me, what they provide are, in a sense, 3 perspectives: an historical perspective, a theoretical perspective, and a personal perspective. The historical perspective, I think, is laid out really very elegantly at the start of the book in Brenda's essay, in which she describes the long history of colonialism in Minnesota and its intersection with, or let's say its manifestation in visual art, in the history of visual art in the state of Minnesota. And then on a parallel track, a completely separate visual art tradition among American Indian artists, which speaks to their own truths and their own lives, and how these two visual art traditions have proceeded on parallel and unfortunately very often separate tracks. The other historical perspective, I think, was provided by Patricia Marquand Norby in her essay on George Morrison, his life and his artistic career. The theoretical perspective, in my mind, comes from Christopher Pex's essay. He starts out by discussing the work of Oscar Howe, but then kind of quickly moves into a more sort of theoretical approach, describing these binaries that have really limited how we think about American Indian art, like traditional and modern, or authentic and innovative. And these categories are very in fact, very limiting and bring little to our understanding of the work that American Indian artists have actually done, because they've been involved in, and their work has encompassed all of these different things. Christopher then goes on to take that sort of theoretical framework and discuss the work of 7 more artists who are in the exhibition. And then the personal perspective, I think, comes from Mona Susan Powers' essay on Cynthia Carlson, and Diane Wilson, especially Diane Wilson's essay on Jim Denemy, and her experience living with and loving that artist, Jim Denemy. So that's my perspective on the book.
Yeah, and speaking of the beautifully written essays that you just discussed, thank you for explaining what each of them meant. But I found that the last one by Christopher also invited the reader to look into to look toward the future of Indigenous arts. And I'm wondering if the two of you could say words about your thinking about how the essays were ordered within the book. Because as you mentioned, it's primarily a visual art anthology, but the essays that are included are just so beautifully written, and and they do add a lot to the anthology. So if you could speak a little bit to what I took away from Christopher's essay is that it doesn't stop here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I guess I would say now Howard made the actual decision about the order of the essays. So who knows if I'm getting him right or not. But I guess I would say that my essay came first, because the historians always get to come first. And thinking about, the past, present, maybe even sometimes the future. And when I was writing this essay, what I was kind of fresh off the experience of being on a committee here in Minnesota that talked about art as we were kind of refurbishing and renovating the Capitol, and the Capitol was set to reopen. And I just remember thinking at the time, like, what an incredible tribute to white men the Minnesota Capitol is. And, that you have not only Cass Gilbert, but Cass Gilbert and all his friends. And there was a lot of discussion in the state and at the Minnesota Historical Society about diversity. How are we going to contribute to the diversity and a greater interpretation of life in Minnesota as we restore the Capitol? And I was kind of flabbergasted by the conversation, because from what I can tell, we were just restoring the art of more than a century ago and putting it all back into the Capitol. And there wasn't much diversity. There were a couple of paintings that Native people in Minnesota kind of objected to. One of them was depicting the Dakota War. So after lengthy conversations about art, and the art in the Capitol, 2 paintings were moved to other places in the Capitol. This was the brilliance of the statewide committees. And so it just, I was sort of struck with how contested conversations around art can be. And at the same time, even if many of us consider ourselves people who like and admire historic preservation, at the same time, how it creates absences and it diminishes the perspectives of many people who reside in Minnesota. So that's so I was real happy to write that essay. I'm grateful to Howard for letting us include it in the book, because it really helped me get something off my chest that I was very annoyed with for several years. But I think the point of Chris Pexa's essay in the book, as well as everybody, I think, writing about Native art today, is that we have a lot to say as Indigenous people about history. We have a lot to say about the history of the United States, about the history of Minnesota, and we don't really forget that. But at the same time, we're not people who just live in the past. like everybody else. We are modern people and we're thinking about our children. We're thinking about generations to come and we're thinking about the future. So I think all of that was sort of encapsulated a bit in our thinking when we talked to the various essayists about contributions to the book.
Yeah, you gave us a lot to think about. Yeah, and the art itself is just incredible, and the essays just added so much to it. So, yeah.
I would just add one little bit to what Brenda has said, because you were asking about Christopher's essay, which is so beautifully written. At the very end of his essay, he's describing a mural made by Thomasina Topbear, a young Dakota woman. And this mural covers a wall around an Excel energy substation. So it's out there in the public in this very unart kind of environment, just on the wall. And it's full of all these references to nature and to Dakota mythology. And the way he ends up, his final words in the essay he says, if this is a pastoral, it is a Dakota modern one, which is to say it is ancient and new, and strives in its grand scale to be equal to the vibrant life that makes up this territory, these Očhéthi Šakówiņ homelands. And I think that very nicely kind of summarizes this notion of a Dakota future or a Dakota futurism.
Yeah, that's what made me think of the question. So thank you, Margret and Michelle. So, as you pointed out, and I'm really happy that you have subverted the traditional idea of what locker room talk is and gave it, some beautiful new life, because women's conversations are so important. As you pointed out, our conversations are focused on caring about each other and ourselves, our communities, and our world. And so this anthology is basically a call to action. Even the art, the cover art, the photos by Leslie Barlow sort of speak to me in that way. So can you talk a little bit about the need for women to celebrate our way of being?
Yes, thank you, Carolyn. Well, as we've touched on, when we think of locker room talk, we think of maybe a pack of high school boys in a locker room. Maybe we think of that particular politician elected to the highest office. And we think of when they're together, men can show the worst side of themselves when they're in private. And we wanted to show women together when they're in private can show the best side of themselves. And women are often caretakers in lots of different ways, with their families, with their communities. And we wanted to shine a light on that and see how we could, like you said, subvert that traditional idea of what locker room talk is. So the book itself started over Zoom. So Michelle and I were both stuck in the pandemic and had to communicate that way. So even that kind of digital connection was really powerful to get this book kicked off. And you mentioned Leslie Barlow's cover art. It actually shows women in conversation over Zoom.
Yeah.
I think the series was called Portraits During a Pandemic. Is that right, Michelle? So the people that contributed pieces to the book really did a wonderful job of showing that how women care for each other, their communities, the world around them. There are stories that represent girlhood transformation, college support systems, just ordinary conversations in the kitchen. And even, as Michelle touched on, the Women's March in Washington, D.C. So we feel like representing these ordinary stories and extraordinary stories it can be really powerful. And so what's funny is that Michelle and I, putting together an anthology takes quite a long time. You have to send out the call, you review all the pieces, you decide on the selection, the order, and so it takes a minute. And we thought, gosh, will this still feel relevant when we publish it? Will this be old news, locker room talk? And we find that, unfortunately, it is still relevant. Yes, women's voices do still need to be amplified. Women's rights are more at risk than ever. And so I really appreciate all the women who contributed to this book.
Yeah, if I recall, there were 38 pieces in the book, I think, which is quite a lot for an anthology. So I'm very curious to know, what was your selection process? You must have had a million submissions. So how did you select the pieces that you ended up with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did have a lot of submissions, and there were, unfortunately, like there always is with an anthology, there were pieces that we didn't have room for that I wish we would have. And again, that's part of, we've thought about what would a second volume of Locker Room Talk look like. But as we were going through, as I mentioned, it was a mixture of solicited pieces and then just putting out broad calls. And once we could finally kind of be together, we would sit down and look at the pieces, and it felt like there was an arc. There was an emotional arc, there was a narrative arc, and the way that the pieces complemented each other really kind of, that along with Leslie's artwork really gave us a sense that there was something happening. There was something coherent about this collection, but at the same time, it wasn't meant to be representative of all. Of course, women contain multitudes, but it really felt like it was capturing some really essential experiences that resonate with a lot of women. And it's been great to hear from women. Margret and I have talked to a couple of book groups, and it's been great to hear how the pieces resonate, and different pieces resonate with different women. And I love that about the book, that it offers something to everyone. And I don't mean just women, because I've had men who have said that they found it a really enlightening to read, and it's kind of revealed to them some things that maybe they hadn't really thought about. So it was a lot of fun to put the book together. I mean, it was a lot of work, but at the same time, it was just I was just so pleased with the work that came in, and all of the new voices that we were able to include.
Mm-hmm. And Shannon, you sort of touched on one of my other questions too, about why it's focused on young adults. You mentioned that it's the book that you wish you had, and so did the author of the foreword. She said the same thing, and that this was lacking when you were kids. And she said something about having grown up in a white neighborhood and just not even knowing that there were other people of color around, or transracial adoptees. And so just speak a little bit to why, about the importance of this for young transracial adoptees.
Yeah, so that was Rebecca Carroll
Yeah,
wrote the foreword for us. Yes,
Mhm.
and she did mention that that feeling of isolation that is endemic to the experience of I would say most transracial adoptees, and definitely most adoptees, period. And it's a structurally isolating experience, so that even if, you know, for instance, in the 80s, when I was in elementary school, and the 90s when I was in high school, I did have classmates who were also transracial adoptees, but we didn't have a language to discuss our experience. We didn't have a context to discuss our experiences. And so, and we also didn't feel like in some ways we had permission, right, to discuss, especially the complexities, right? I mean, so adoptees are always supposed to be grateful, right? And so if you're having, you know, feelings of anger or abandonment, or you know, questions about your biological family, about the loss of your, you know, home community, racial identity, cultural identity, particularly like in white environments, a lot of adoptees don't feel like they can talk about that, or we don't know how. And so, yeah. So that was another reason why we thought it was really important to create this anthology as well, to unify ourselves. You know, we're mostly like now middle-aged adult adoptees ourselves, many of us with families of our own. But also, you know, the book is dedicated, you know, to all the young adoptees out there, right? Nicole and I said, like, we got you, you know, and we mean that. And yeah, it's been very moving. The book came out in October 2023. So, you know, it's been out a little while now. And so it's slowly making its way into school libraries, into community bookstores, into community spaces. And we also made sure that we had 5 book launch events around the country, where different contributors were located, in order to also like build that physical community as the book rolled out as well.
Yeah, I was very moved to see that you have authors in the book from a variety of communities. You had transracial adoptees who were Native American, African American, different parts of Asia.
Yeah, we have a lot of Korean adoptees. Me and Mariana Lockington are Black American. We have Susan Harness, who is Native American, doesn't know her exact origin, but is Native American. We have Mexican American author. We have Taiwanese American.
People from different communities. How did you do that?
Right. No, that's a great question. So we had Nicole and I, my co-editor, Nicole Chung, we had lengthy discussions about, okay, do we want this to be a middle grade anthology? Do we want this to be middle grade in YA? Do we want it just to be YA? Ultimately went with YA because we felt like, you know, if we tried to do sort of a mixed genre with YA and middle grade, there would be some thematic issues that wouldn't be appropriate for, like, say, an 11-year-old or a 10-year-old. But we also had a lot of discussions about, like, okay, is this going to be a general anthology for writers who identify as adoptees, regardless of their race? Or is this going to be specifically a BIPOC adoptee writers anthology? And so what we ultimately decided was, we want the best stories by adoptees with teen adoptee protagonists, regardless of their racial or cultural background, regardless of genre. And then we're going to solicit our friends and colleagues. We're going to do general solicitation as well, and we're going to see what we get, and we're going to choose the best pieces based on that. And that's what we did. And it just so happened that all the best pieces that we received were from BIPOC adoptee authors.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. So, wow, nice process. Because, you know, I wondered if you had, how can I say this? When I saw that, you know, because here in Minnesota, I'm so used to seeing Korean adoptees, yeah, as well as one or two African-American ones. But I was totally surprised and happy to see people from a variety of communities.
And there were definitely some communities that we had to actively, solicit and kind of hound, because it's like, okay, we need, like Susan Harness is not a fiction writer, but she is a friend, a colleague, somebody who has been in adoptee organizing spaces for years and done a lot of really important work, and really was excited to give it a shot, and worked with us very closely in the editing process. And so we were so happy to get her piece. So yeah, I mean, it definitely, I think it does help too that this was not the first anthology that either Nicole or I had edited. And so, sort of seeking that balance and figuring out, how to do that. And then we had a nice mix of support and sort of grounding from our editor, Megan Ilitsky at HarperTeen as well. She saw the value of the book from the very beginning of the book proposal, which that's what you need for a book like this, for sure. Yeah.
Right. So you mentioned that both of you have edited other anthologies, and we're both aware of other anthologies out there about transracial adoptees. But is this the first one that's for young adults?
This is the first anthology to my knowledge, right? This is the first anthology of short stories by adoptees about adoptees, to my knowledge, period. It is also the first anthology of YA short stories by adoptees, about adoptees, and the first anthology of BIPOC adoptees writing about teen adoptees.
Yeah.
It's all those things. And it's, it came out in 2023, which is nuts, but that this should have been, we should have, this plethora of stories. Viet Wang calls it's narrative plenitude versus narrative scarcity, right? Like so many of our historically marginalized communities.
Somebody's got to start it. Thank you for starting it.
Thank you. No,
since there isn't,
and that's what feeds me. And I know Nicole feels the same way, that it's work. This is work for sure. I'm not trying to, sugarcoat it. It's not easy. Very well, writing and publishing. But I feel like if you are hooked in and doing the work that you came here to do, it also feeds you in these very foundational and sort of life-sustaining ways. So I feel very lucky, actually, that I have this practice and that I've had it, since I could read. Yeah.
I think we are all lucky that you're doing it.
Oh, thank you, my friend.
Jeff. Raised by Wolves is a unique anthology. I love that you said earlier that when you were explaining what it is, that it is Graywolf's 50th anniversary project, and how you contacted 50 poets and had them, they chose the poems that would be written about, or did they also select the writers that they wanted to comment on their poems? How did that work?
Yeah, that's right. So, we did a call sort of similar, within the community of Graywolf poets, and just said, across these 50 years, who would you like to be included in this chorus of voices? We could only include 50. So, we knew there was this sort of limitation. We could have doubled, tripled, and, quadrupled that if we wanted to, but we wanted to keep a sort of readable and digestible whole. And poets were really given free range in terms of what they wanted to select. My job, I did have to step in a few times and sort of say, "Oh, I'm afraid someone already picked Claudia Rankine to write about. Could you choose somebody else?" There were some overlaps that we had to kind of avoid, but that actually turned out to be far more minimal than I would have thought. And then each poet who chose that poem wrote about why they chose that poem. So that's how those kind of brief prose pieces came about into the anthology. Because we understand that people, when they come across a page, or they come across a page in the New Yorker or something, and they see things written in lines, there can be an anxiety that that readers have about poetry. So I think it's helpful when you also get a bit of prose, or a little prose essay, or kind of a reflection, really, about why that poem works, or what does that poem do, or what emotions or sense of social justice, or just artful lyricism does that poem convey to this particular reader who chose it. What I also loved about the prose pieces is you start to trace across the book, or I hope readers trace across the book, certain lineages, elders who are passing on the torches to younger writers. And that conversation that happens in many ways across the anthology, to me, is the heart of the anthology. I mean, the poems themselves are important in and of themselves, but as you start to read across them and the prose pieces, you start sort of seeing these modes of influence with each other. I love the way that one of my teachers, Carl Phillips, an amazing poet, who has been, long a presence in the Cave Canem community of African American poets, and himself writes a very particular kind of line that comes out of his experience as a Black and gay man. And Carl selected a poem by Minneapolis poet Danez Smith, who's also a finalist this year for the Minnesota Book Award, and who is also part of that community, but they're decades removed from each other. And I loved that sense of mentorship and conversation, lineage and influence, that kind of sense of descendants that is traceable, I think, across the anthology.
Yeah, I saw that as well and loved it. And as a prose writer myself, having those essays, along with the poems was very, very helpful to me, because admittedly, I don't really understand poetry a lot, but it was really good to see, excuse me, to see the essays, which for me gave a lot of context. It also spoke more about, made me appreciate the works of poetry themselves. I have one final question that I did put on the list here. We often find that when we're given a reading or giving a talk, that people ask questions but no one, there are things that we wish people would ask about, and they don't. So, do any of you have something that you'd like to talk about that no one ever asks and you wish they would?
I'll jump in. I think many, writers included, but readers and people, I think the role of the editor is a mysterious one to many people, So that sense of, who are you and what do you do, and what's your role, and what's your experience of editing books, let alone, books of poetry or anthologies of poetry like this one. And in a way, it's the editor's job to disappear, right? I mean, it's the author's book, and the editor, strives to make themselves irrelevant, I think, in a certain way. But that said, especially with editing this anthology, I really miss editing it. It's one of the books I think I have felt, I mean, I've worked at Graywolf for over 25 years and have edited a lot of different kinds of books with a lot of different kinds of writers, but there was something about the invitation to send out to our poets, all of whom I have edited and worked with before, but getting those responses back about who those poets wanted to include in the anthology was like, oh, wow, oh, wow, that poet's going to write about, oh, Dinez Smith is going to write about Danica Kelly. How perfect, I mean, it felt, I miss that kind of, what felt like these kind of daily interactions with, 50 years of Graywolf's history. So, some of what happens, I think, to the editor inside these processes, very emotional. While we were editing this anthology, I mean, a poet I'd worked with for a very long time, Saskia Hamilton, passed away after a very long cancer. And she, honestly, a week or 10 days before she died, she sent the piece in to be included for this anthology. And soon after that, Claudia Rankin, the author of Citizen, she wrote, she included a poem by Saskia and wrote about it. So there's a lot of the emotional experience for me, for the editors, I think, underneath these books that the readers don't even necessarily see, or they kind of pick up on, and it feels like every book has some of those kinds of experiences to it, but this one, I think just the sheer number of voices and ways that writers sort of picked each other up, I think was just very moving to me, and I wanted the opportunity to say that, so thank you.
Wow, okay. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up here, and thank you all so much for participating. And again, congratulations on being finalists for the Minnesota Book Award in the anthology category. As we know, there are a lot of books that are submitted and only 4 are selected as finalists. So that's really, really an honor. Thank you to our tremendous anthology category finalists and to all of you watching for taking part in this Meet the Finalists panel. If you enjoyed this talk, you can find a treasure trove of past events archived on the YouTube channel of the Minnesota Book Awards Steward Organization, the Friends of the St. Paul Public Library. You can find out more about future programs on their website, thefriends.org. And in particular, mark your calendars for Tuesday, April 22nd. That's the evening that the winner in this category and 9 others are finally revealed. Please join us in St. Paul at the Ordway Center for the Performing Arts. Tickets are $29, inclusive of processing fees. A free live stream will also be available. So visit thefriends.org/m/MNBA for details. So so goodbye to everyone, and thank you again for this conversation.